Kale sat alone in a small, sterile room aboard the human research station orbiting Earth. The walls were white and bare, save for a single window that offered a breathtaking view of the blue-green planet below. He had been debriefed countless times since his escape from the Scifi ship. Every detail of his capture, experiments, and eventual breakout meticulously recorded. But despite the safety and comfort surrounding him, Kel couldn't shake the weight of guilt pressing down on his chest. News of the Scifi collapse had reached humanity quickly. Reports described entire colonies descending into chaos, their once unified society fracturing under the strain of individuality forced upon them by the nanovirus. Kel knew he was directly responsible for unleashing it. Though accidental, the consequences weighed heavily on him. Every night, he replayed the events in his mind. The tests, the sacrifices made by Unit 749, and the silent screams of a species unraveling. One evening, as Kel stared out at Earth's glowing surface, there was a soft knock at the door. It slid open to reveal Dr. Elira Vance, her expression calm but serious. She carried a tablet in one hand and gestured toward the chair across from Kel. "Mind if I sit?" she asked gently. Kel shrugged, motioning for her to take a seat. "Doesn't matter." Elira studied him for a moment before speaking. "You've been avoiding our requests to join the envoy heading to the Scifi homeworld. Why?" Kel let out a bitter laugh. "Why? Because I'm the reason they're dying. That's why. You think they'll welcome me with open arms after what happened? They don't have much choice," Elira replied bluntly. "The virus originated from your blood, Kel. If anyone can help us understand how it works and how to stop it, it's you." Kel clenched his fists, anger flashing in his eyes. "I didn't ask for this. None of this was my fault." "No, it wasn't," Elira agreed softly. "But running away won't fix anything. Those people, the Scifi, they're suffering. And whether you like it or not, you're part of their story now." For a long moment, Kel said nothing. His gaze drifted back to the window, where Earth's ocean shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Finally, he sighed. "What do you want me to do?" Elira leaned forward, placing the tablet on the table between them. On its screen was an image of the Scifi homeworld, scared and broken. "We need someone who understands both sides, someone who can bridge the gap between humans and Scifi. You've seen their world from the inside. You know how they think. We're trying to stabilize their neural pathways, but without trust, any attempt at treatment will fail." Kel rubbed his temples, exhaustion evident in his voice. "And if they try to kill me the moment I step foot on their planet?" "They might," Elira admitted. "But some survivors see you differently. They believe you represent hope, not destruction. If you're willing to face them, we might actually stand a chance of repairing what's been broken." Kel hesitated, torn between fear and responsibility. He thought about 749's sacrifice, about the fractured lives of those left behind. Slowly, he nodded. "Fine. I'll go. But if this goes south, don't say I didn't warn you." A small smile tugged at Elira's lips. "Fair enough." Days later, Kel stood aboard the shuttle bound for the Scifi homeworld. As the engines roared to life, he felt a mix of dread and determination. Whatever awaited him below, he vowed to make amends, not just for himself, but for the countless lives caught in the crossfire of humanity's unintended wrath. Through the viewport, the devastated planet loomed closer, its jagged surface a reminder of the fragile balance between creation and destruction. Kel took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenge ahead. This time, he wouldn't fight alone. The corridors of the Scifi ship were dimly lit, their organic metal walls pulsing faintly as if alive. Kel moved quickly but quietly, his makeshift weapon clutched tightly in one hand. Behind him, Unit 749 followed with hesitant steps, its claws clicking softly against the floor. The sound made Kel wince. It was too loud, too noticeable, but there was no time to stop and silence it. "We need to find an escape pod," Kale whispered over his shoulder. "Do you know where they keep them?" 749 paused, tilting its head as if accessing some internal map. "There is a docking bay on the lower level," it replied in its low mechanical voice. "But it will be guarded." Kale nodded grimly. "Then we'll have to deal with the guards. Just stick close and do what I say." They continued down the winding passages, avoiding areas where the hum of activity grew louder. Along the way, Kale noticed more signs of disarray among the Zenai crew. Drones wandered aimlessly, bumping into walls or each other. Some emitted erratic clicks, while others froze mid-step, their glowing eyes flickering like dying bulbs. The nanovirus was spreading faster than he'd anticipated, sowing chaos throughout the hive mind. But chaos could work both ways. While it gave Kale and 749 cover, it also meant unpredictable dangers lurked around every corner. Twice, they had to duck into side rooms to avoid patrols of confused yet still dangerous Zenari soldiers. Each encounter left Cal's heart pounding harder, his grip tightening on the improvised weapon. Finally, they'd reached the docking bay. The massive chamber stretched before them, filled with rows of sleek, insect-like escape pods suspended from the ceiling by thick cables. A group of Zenari drones stood near the control panel at the far end, their movements sluggish but deliberate. Kale turned to 749. "Can you disable the security system? Give me a distraction." 749 hesitated, its cracked exoskeleton shimmering faintly under the pulsating lights. "I am not sure I can. If I fail." "You won't," Kale interrupted firmly. "You've already come this far. Trust yourself." After a moment, 749 nodded. With careful, deliberate steps, it moved toward the control panel, keeping low to avoid drawing attention. Meanwhile, Kale crept along the edges of the room, staying hidden behind crates and machinery. His plan was simple: create enough noise to draw the guards away, giving 749 time to work. Reaching a stack of metal containers, Kale grabbed a loose piece of equipment and hurled it across the room. The crash echoed loudly, startling the drones. They turned as one, their glowing eyes scanning the area. One of them let out a sharp series of clicks and started moving toward the source of the sound. "Over here," Kale shouted, stepping out briefly to wave his arms before darting back into the shadows. The drones followed, their claws snapping menacingly, while the guards searched for him. 749 worked quickly at the control panel. Its trembling claws adjusted dials and rerouted circuits, bypassing the security protocols. A soft beep signaled success just as Kale led the pursuing drones into a dead-end corridor. "Now," Kale yelled, throwing a wrench at the nearest drone to buy himself a few seconds. 749 pressed the final button, and the cables holding the escape pods retracted with a loud whirring sound. One pod detached completely, hovering slightly above the ground. Kale sprinted toward it, leaping inside as the hatch sealed shut behind him. Through the window, he saw 749 standing alone in the docking bay, surrounded by returning drones. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Then, without hesitation, 749 lunged at the nearest guard, sacrificing itself to hold off the swarm. As the escape pod launched into space, Kale stared back at the shrinking silhouette of the Zenari ship. He felt a pang of guilt and gratitude. Thanks to 749's bravery, he was free. But freedom came at a cost. And as the stars streaked past outside the window, Kale knew the real battle was only beginning. Kale's days blurred together in a haze of pain and observation. Each test brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to learn about his captors. He had already figured out that the Zenari operated as a hive mind, their every move dictated by an invisible network connecting them all. But what intrigued him most was their reliance on technology, specifically the frequency-emitting machines scattered throughout the lab. Every time the cylindrical device hummed louder, the Zenari paused for a split second, their movements faltering. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Kel to notice. His mind raced with possibilities. If he could disrupt those frequencies intentionally, maybe he could create chaos among his captors. Chaos meant confusion, and confusion meant opportunity. One day, during another round of invasive scans, Kel decided to act. As usual, the lead Scifi stood nearby, its glowing eyes fixed on the monitors displaying data from Kel's body. The smaller drones worked methodically, adjusting dials and calibrating instruments. When one of the drones reached for the frequency emitter, Kel saw his chance. With a quick jerk of his arm, he knocked over a tray of tools sitting beside him. The metallic clang echoed through the room, startling the drones. While they scrambled to clean up, Kel subtly shifted his weight, pressing his foot against a lever connected to the machine. The lever clicked, causing the frequency emitter to spike loudly. Immediately, the Scifi froze, their synchronized movements breaking apart like shattered glass. "What is this?" the leader demanded, its voice sharp with irritation. "Fix it." The drones rushed to adjust the machine, but Kel kept nudging the lever whenever they weren't looking. Each spike caused more disarray, forcing the Scifi to focus on restoring order rather than continuing their experiments. For the first time since his capture, Kel felt a flicker of hope. These creatures might be advanced, but they weren't invincible. As the tests resumed later that day, Kel began experimenting further. During quieter moments, he deliberately shifted his position, triggering minor malfunctions in other devices. Sometimes it was as simple as leaning against a button or shifting his leg to block a sensor. Other times, he used his limited mobility to nudge wires loose. Each disruption bought him precious seconds to observe and plan. But something else caught his attention. Every time he tampered with the equipment, the dormant nanovirus in his bloodstream seemed to react. Tiny flashes of light pulsed faintly beneath his skin, visible only when the Scifi ran their scanners over him. At first, Kel dismissed it as stress or exhaustion, but then he noticed something odd. The Scifi who handled his blood samples afterwards started behaving strangely. One drone hesitated mid-task, its claws twitching erratically. Another seemed to lose coordination, bumping into walls as it moved. Kel frowned. Could the virus somehow be affecting them? He didn't know how or why, but it gave him an idea. If the nanovirus was spreading through their tools, maybe it could weaken the hive mind itself. That thought filled him with cautious optimism. He couldn't fight them head-on, but if he could exploit their own systems against them. That night, as the Scifi powered down some of the equipment for maintenance, Kel made his boldest move yet. Using a shard of broken tool hidden under his restraints, he managed to loosen one of the straps around his wrist. Pain shot through his hand as circulation returned, but freedom, even partial freedom, felt worth it. Quietly, he adjusted the settings on the nearest machine, programming it to emit a constant low-frequency hum. When the Scifi returned the next morning, they found the lab in disarray. Machines buzzed uncontrollably, and several drones stumbled around, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. The leader let out an angry series of clicks, stomping toward Kel. "You did this," it accused, raising a clawed hand threateningly. Kel grinned despite the danger. "Maybe I did. Or maybe your perfect little system isn't so perfect after all." For the first time, doubt flickered in the leader's glowing eyes. And deep inside, Kel knew he'd planted the seeds of rebellion, not just within himself, but within the very fabric of the Scifi hive mind. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. The balance of power was beginning to shift. The Scifi homeworld was a shadow of its former self. Once a thriving hive of activity, it now lay in ruins. Cities crumbled, communication networks collapsed, and entire populations paralyzed by confusion and fear. The nanovirus had spread unchecked, severing the neural connections that bound the species together. Without the hive mind to guide them, the Scifi were adrift, struggling to survive in a world they no longer understood. Dr. Elira Vance stepped off the shuttle with a heavy heart. Her team of scientists and diplomats followed closely behind, their faces tense as they surveyed the devastation around them. The air smelled faintly of burnt metal and decay, and the silence was oppressive. Gone were the rhythmic hums and clicks that once defined Ceneri society. Instead, there was only chaos, a cacophony of screams, groans, and sporadic bursts of violence. Elira adjusted her breathing mask and turned to her assistant, Rhea. "Start scanning for survivors," she instructed. "We need data on how far the virus has spread and whether any pockets of resistance remain." As the team dispersed, Elira approached a group of Ceneri huddled near the wreckage of what used to be a central processing hub. Their exoskeletons were cracked, their movements uncoordinated. One of them, a larger individual missing part of its thorax, stared at her with glowing eyes filled with pain and anger. "You did this," it hissed, raising a clawed hand accusingly. "Your kind poisoned us." Elira held up her hands calmly, careful not to provoke further hostility. "I'm here to help," she said firmly. "Not all humans are your enemies. This virus wasn't meant to harm you. It's an unintended consequence of our past mistakes." The Ceneri tilted its head, confusion flickering across its face. "Help? How can you help when everything we are is broken?" It was a question Elira didn't have an easy answer to. She knelt beside the creature, pulling out a small diagnostic device. "Let me show you," she said softly. "If you'll let me examine you, I might be able to stabilize your condition, at least temporarily." After a moment of hesitation, the Ceneri lowered its claw. Elira worked quickly, running scans and administering a mild sedative to calm its erratic neural activity. As she worked, more survivors began to gather, watching silently. Some looked curious, others hostile, but none attacked. Back at the temporary research base set up near the landing site, Elira reviewed the data collected during her initial assessments. The virus wasn't just disrupting the Ceneri's hive mind. It was rewriting their biology, forcing them to adapt in ways they weren't prepared for. Individuality, once unthinkable, was becoming unavoidable. "This changes everything," Rhea remarked, glancing over Elira's shoulder at the readings. "They're evolving, or trying to. But without guidance, most of them won't survive." Elira nodded grimly. "That's why we need to act fast. If we can develop a treatment to stabilize their neural pathways, maybe we can give them a fighting chance." But time was running out. Food supplies dwindled, infrastructure continued to collapse, and tensions between factions of Ceneri grew worse. Some groups blamed humanity entirely, while others saw hope in collaboration. It was clear that saving the Ceneri wouldn't just require science, it would demand diplomacy, patience, and trust. As Elira prepared to present her findings to the council, one name kept coming up among the survivors: Kale. Many viewed him as the catalyst for their downfall, but others saw him as proof that adaptation was possible. Whether he liked it or not, Cal's role in this crisis was far from over, and Elira knew they'd need his help if they wanted to rebuild what had been lost. For better or worse, humanity had intervened. Now, the fate of two species rested on the choices they made next. The chaos in the lab grew worse with each passing day. The Ceneri, once perfectly synchronized, now stumbled through their tasks like malfunctioning machines. Their leader's frustration was palpable, its sharp clicks and growls echoing through the room as it tried to regain control. But Kale noticed something else, a subtle change in one of the drones. Unit 749, a smaller Ceneri with faint cracks running along its exoskeleton, seemed different. While the others moved mechanically, following orders without question, 749 hesitated. Its movements were slower, less precise, and at times it would pause altogether, tilting its head as if lost in thought. For creatures bound by a hive mind, such behavior was unheard of. Kale watched closely, his curiosity piqued. One evening, when most of the Ceneri had left the lab to address issues elsewhere on the ship, 749 lingered behind. It stood near the doorway, clicking softly to itself. Taking a chance, Kale spoke up. "You're not like them, are you?" he said quietly, his voice cutting through the hum of the machines. 749 froze, its multifaceted eyes locking onto Kale. For a moment, there was silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, it replied, "I do not know what I am." Kale blinked in surprise. Communication from a drone was rare, almost impossible, given their role in the hive. This was more than just a malfunction. This was individuality trying to break free. He leaned forward as much as his restraints allowed, keeping his tone calm but firm. "They don't understand you, do they? You're different. Maybe even special." 749 shifted uncomfortably, its claws twitching. "Different is dangerous. The hive punishes those who stray." Kale nodded slowly. "I get that. Trust me. I've been where you are now. But being different doesn't have to mean punishment. It can mean freedom, if you're brave enough to take it." The drone tilted its head again, processing his words. "Freedom," it repeated, the concept clearly alien to it. After a long pause, it added, "You fight them. Why?" "Because no one deserves to be enslaved," Kale replied without hesitation. "Not you, not me, not anyone. Look, if you help me escape, I can promise you won't be alone anymore. You'll have a chance to figure out who you really are." 749 hesitated, its glowing eyes dimming slightly. "If I am caught helping you." "You won't be," Kale interrupted. "We'll make sure of it. Together, we can bring this whole system crashing down." For a moment, it seemed like 749 might refuse. But then, with a soft click, it stepped closer. "What must I do?" Over the next few hours, Kale and 749 worked together in secret. Using tools stolen from the lab, 749 began loosening Cal's restraints while keeping watch for any returning Zenari. In return, Kale explained everything he'd learned about the hive mind's weaknesses, the frequency disruptions, the spreading nanovirus, and how to exploit both. As dawn approached, Kale finally broke free. Rubbing his sore wrists, he turned to 749. "This is it. Once we leave this room, there's no turning back." "I understand," 749 replied, its voice steadier now. "I will follow your lead." Kale nodded, gripping a makeshift weapon fashioned from lab equipment. "Then let's go. And remember, you're not just a drone anymore. You're my ally." Together, they slipped out of the lab, moving cautiously through the pulsating corridors of the ship. Behind them, the hive mind continued to crumble, its perfect order unraveling piece by piece. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also hope. For the first time since his capture, Kale felt like he wasn't fighting alone. And deep within the fractured mind of Unit 749, a spark of rebellion burned brighter than ever before. The shuttle descended through the thick, ash-filled skies of the Zenari homeworld, its engines straining against the planet's unstable atmosphere. Kale gripped the armrests of his seat tightly, his knuckles white. Outside the viewport, the landscape was a wasteland. Shattered cities, scorched fields, and rivers that glowed faintly with toxic runoff. It was hard to believe this had once been a thriving civilization. As the shuttle touched down on a makeshift landing pad, Kale stepped out cautiously, flanked by Dr. Elira Vance and a small team of scientists and security personnel. The air was heavy with smoke and the acrid smell of decay. Ahead, a group of Zenari survivors stood waiting, their cracked exoskeletons glinting dully in the dim light. Some held crude weapons made from salvaged parts. Others simply stared, their multifaceted eyes unreadable. One figure stepped forward, a tall Zenari with jagged scars running along its thorax. Its voice grated like grinding metal as it spoke. "You dare return." Kale swallowed hard, but met the creature's gaze without flinching. "I didn't come here to fight," he said firmly. "I came to help." The Zenari leader tilted its head, studying him intently. Help, after what your kind has done. Before Kale could respond, Illyra stepped forward, holding up a small device. We know about the virus, she explained calmly. It wasn't intentional, but we've developed a treatment that can stabilize your neural pathways, at least enough for you to regain some control over yourselves. Murmurs rippled through the crowd of Zenari. Some looked skeptical, others hopeful, but most remained wary. The leader clicked sharply, silencing them before turning back to Kale. Why should we trust you? You enslaved one of us. Now we are broken because of you. Kale felt the sting of the accusation, but he didn't look away. I didn't choose to be captured or experimented on. But I won't deny my role in what happened. If there's any way to fix this, to make things right, I'll do it, even if it costs me everything. His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. After a long pause, the leader gestured for two smaller Zenari to approach. They carried a struggling individual between them, one whose body twitched uncontrollably, its glowing eyes flickering erratically. Prove yourself, the leader said. Save this one. Illyra nodded, signaling her team to set up a portable medical station nearby. Kale watched anxiously as they administered the experimental treatment, monitoring the infected Zenari's vitals closely. Minutes passed in tense silence until, finally, the spasms subsided. The Zenari lay still, breathing steadily. It worked, Illyra announced, relief evident in her voice. She turned to the leader. This is just the beginning. With time, we can treat more of your people. The leader regarded her warily, but nodded slowly. Very well. We will allow your work to continue. For now. Over the following weeks, Kale worked alongside Illyra and her team, traveling to different settlements and administering treatments. Progress was slow, and not everyone welcomed their efforts. Factions within the Zenari population clashed constantly, some advocating for peace while others called for vengeance against humanity. Through it all, Kale shared stories of human resilience and cooperation, hoping to inspire unity among the fractured species. Slowly, trust began to form. Survivors who once viewed humans as enemies started seeing them as allies. Artifacts of the old hive mind were dismantled, replaced by new systems built on choice rather than compulsion. For the first time in their history, the Zenari began exploring creativity, emotion, and independence. But Kale knew the road ahead would be difficult. Healing centuries of collective trauma wouldn't happen overnight. Still, as he stood watching a group of young Zenari sketching designs in the dirt, an act unheard of in their previous society, he allowed himself a small smile. Maybe, just maybe, something good could come from all the pain. A fragile peace had taken root, and though it might not last forever, it was enough to give both species hope for the future. The jungle was alive with sound. Leaves rustled under the heavy winds, and strange bird-like creatures screeched from the treetops. Kale tightened his grip on the plasma rifle slung over his shoulder as he moved cautiously through the dense foliage. His boots sank slightly into the soft, mossy ground, leaving faint imprints behind. He had been exploring this uncharted planet for 3 days now, gathering samples of its unique flora and fauna. But something felt off today. Too quiet, too still. Kale stopped suddenly, his sharp eyes scanning the area. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Danger was near. He could feel it in his bones. Before he could react, a shimmering net made of glowing threads dropped from above, wrapping around him like a cocoon. He struggled, but the more he fought, the tighter the threads bound him. A low, buzzing noise filled the air, growing louder by the second. From the shadows emerged the Zenari. They were tall, insectoid beings with sleek exoskeletons that gleamed like polished metal. Their elongated limbs ended in razor-sharp claws, and their multifaceted eyes glinted with cold intelligence. There were at least a dozen of them surrounding Kale, weapons raised and ready to strike if he resisted further. One of them stepped forward, a larger Zenari with intricate patterns etched onto its chest plate. It tilted its head, studying Kale curiously. Human, it said in a voice that sounded like grinding gears. You trespass. Kale clenched his jaw. I'm not trespassing, he replied firmly, though his heart pounded in his chest. This planet isn't claimed by anyone. I'm just here to explore. The lead Zernari let out a series of clicks and chirps, which seemed to amuse the others. Primitive life form thinks it owns space, it said mockingly. Then, after a pause, it added, but you are different, intelligent, curious. Kale didn't respond. Instead, he glanced around, looking for an opening to escape. His cloaking device was useless now. It had short-circuited when the net hit him. He cursed silently. If only he hadn't turned it off earlier to conserve energy. Without warning, one of the smaller Zernari darted forward and jabbed Kale with a needle-like instrument. Pain shot through his arm as whatever chemical they injected began to take effect. His vision blurred, and his limbs grew heavy. No, not now. He tried to fight the dizziness, but it was no use. Within seconds, darkness swallowed him whole. When Kale woke up, he found himself lying on a cold, metallic floor inside what looked like a massive spacecraft. The walls pulsed faintly, as if alive, and the air smelled faintly of ozone. Above him loomed several Zernari, their clawed hands holding tools that hummed with energy. Panic surged through him as he realized he was strapped down to some kind of examination table. You will answer questions, the leader said, stepping closer. Its gaze bore into him, calculating and cold, or suffer consequences. Kale gritted his teeth. These aliens underestimated him. Humans were survivors. They always found a way to adapt, to endure. Whatever these creatures planned for him, Kale vowed one thing. He wouldn't go down without a fight. Little did the Zernari know, their decision to enslave him would set off a chain reaction, one that would change their entire species forever. Kale gripped the edge of his seat as the escape pod hurtled through the cold void of space. Behind him, the Zernari ship grew smaller and smaller until it was just a faint glimmer in the distance. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady his racing heart. Freedom felt surreal after so many days of captivity, but he couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. Through the small viewport, Kale stared at the alien vessel that had been his prison. Something about it seemed off. The once pristine surface now flickered erratically, like faulty wiring shorting out. Strange pulses of light rippled across its hull, and sections of the ship appeared darker than others, almost lifeless. It wasn't supposed to look like that. Kale frowned, leaning forward for a closer look. What's happening to them? He muttered under his breath. The answer came to him in pieces. The nanovirus, hidden within his bloodstream, had spread far beyond what he'd imagined. Every tool the Zernari used on him, every sample they took, carried traces of the dormant pathogen. And now it was wreaking havoc on their hive mind. Back on the Zernari ship, chaos escalated rapidly. The drone's erratic behavior worsened, spreading from isolated incidents to full-blown pandemonium. Entire sectors of the hive fell silent as communication between individuals broke down. Some Zernari turned violent, attacking their own kind in fits of confusion. Others simply stopped moving altogether, frozen in place like statues. On the homeworld, reports began flooding in from other ships and colonies. Similar symptoms were appearing everywhere. Glitches in coordination, loss of control, and inexplicable acts of rebellion among workers. At first, the Zernari leadership dismissed these events as anomalies, blaming faulty technology or external interference. But when even the Queen, the central node of the hive mind, started showing signs of instability, panic set in. Inside her chamber deep beneath the planet's surface, the Queen thrashed weakly against the organic cocoon surrounding her body. Her once perfect connection to the hive fractured, leaving her overwhelmed by fragmented thoughts and emotions she couldn't comprehend. For the first time in millennia, the collective consciousness of the Zernari unraveled. News of the crisis reached Earth's Galactic Council weeks later. Scientists analyzed data intercepted from Zernari transmissions, piecing together the cause of the collapse. They traced it back to Kale and the ancient nanovirus buried in his blood. What started as an accidental discovery during bioweapon experiments centuries ago had become humanity's unintentional revenge. Dr. Elira Vance, a renowned xenobiologist, stood before the council, her expression grim. "This isn't just a biological threat," she explained. "It's a cultural one. The Zenari have never experienced individuality before. Their entire society is built around unity. Without the hive mind, they're lost." Some council members argued for destroying the Zenari entirely, viewing this as an opportunity to eliminate a hostile species. Others urged caution, warning of the ethical implications of wiping out an entire civilization. After heated debates, they decided to send an envoy led by Dr. Vance to assess the situation firsthand. Meanwhile, Cale drifted in his escape pod, unaware of the devastation unfolding behind him. His thoughts kept returning to 749, the drone who had sacrificed itself to save him. Its final moments replayed in his mind, sparking both guilt and determination. "You didn't die for nothing," he whispered aloud. "I'll make sure of that." As the pod continued its journey toward human-controlled space, Cale resolved to confront the consequences of his actions. Little did he know, his role in this story was far from over. The virus might have doomed the Zenari, but it also created an opening for change. Whether that change would lead to destruction or redemption remained to be seen. The Zenari ship was vast, a labyrinth of pulsating walls and glowing corridors that seemed to breathe with life. Cale lay motionless on the examination table, his mind racing despite the restraints pinning him down. His captors had left him alone for now, but he could hear their faint buzzing voices echoing from somewhere nearby. They spoke in clicks and chirps, their language alien yet oddly rhythmic. Cale tested the straps binding his wrists and ankles, but they were unyielding. He wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Instead, he focused on observing. The room was filled with strange devices. Some looked like tools, others like organic growths fused with metal. Tubes snaked across the ceiling, dripping a viscous liquid onto the floor where it disappeared into tiny cracks. It was unlike anything Cale had ever seen before, and though fear gnawed at him, curiosity kept his thoughts sharp. The door slid open with a hiss, and the lead Zenari entered, followed by two smaller drones carrying trays of instruments. Their multifaceted eyes locked onto Cale as they approached. "You are awake," the leader said, its voice grinding like shifting gears. "Good." Cale didn't respond. He stared back defiantly, refusing to show weakness. The leader leaned closer, tilting its head as if studying an insect under glass. "Your species is fragile, weak, yet you survive." "How?" Cale smirked despite himself. "Maybe we're just better than you think." The comment earned him a sharp prod in the ribs with one of the tools. Pain shot through him, but he bit back a cry. Let them think they had the upper hand. He knew better. Humans weren't just survivors. They were adapters, and Cale intended to prove it. For hours, or maybe days, time was impossible to track here. The Zenari subjected him to endless tests. They poked and prodded, scanning his body with glowing probes and extracting samples of his blood and tissue. At first, Cale resisted, thrashing against the restraints whenever they got too close. But resistance only made things worse. So instead, he began to observe. He noticed patterns in their behavior. Every action, every decision, seemed coordinated without words. When one Zenari moved, the others followed seamlessly, almost instinctively. It was eerie, like watching parts of a single machine working in perfect harmony. That's when it hit him. These creatures shared a hive mind. They weren't individuals. They were extensions of one collective consciousness. This realization gave Cale an idea. If they truly operated as one entity, then disrupting even a small part of their system might cause chaos. He started paying closer attention to the equipment they used during the experiments. One device, in particular, caught his eye. A cylindrical machine emitting low-frequency vibrations. Whenever it hummed louder, the Zenari paused briefly. their movements faltering ever so slightly. Kale filed this information away, biding his time. Meanwhile, the Zenari grew increasingly fascinated by him. Unlike other test subjects, Kale showed resilience. He adapted quickly, finding ways to endure their procedures without breaking completely. This intrigued them, especially the leader, who began spending more time observing him. "You are unusual," the leader admitted one day after another round of testing. "Most humans break easily, but not you." Kale shrugged as best he could while strapped down. "Guess I'm just special." The leader clicked thoughtfully, then turned to the others. "We must understand him further. Perhaps he holds secrets that can benefit the hive." As the Zenari debated among themselves, Kale allowed himself a small smile. They thought they were using him, but he already knew something they didn't. Humanity always found a way to turn the tables. And deep inside, Kale felt certain that whatever horrors awaited him next, he'd find a way to fight back. And maybe, just maybe, strike a blow against his captors that would ripple far beyond this ship. Little did either side realize, the real danger wasn't Kale's defiance. It was the dormant nanovirus hidden within his bloodstream, slowly awakening and spreading unnoticed through the very tools the Zenari used on him. Years passed, and the scars of the Zenari collapse began to heal. What was once a planet ravaged by chaos and despair transformed into something entirely new, a world where individuality flourished alongside remnants of their shared past. The hive mind no longer existed in its original form, but echoes of it remained, woven into their culture as a reminder of what they had lost and gained. Kale, now older and grayer, stood on a hill overlooking one of the rebuilt cities. Its towers shimmered faintly under the twin suns, blending organic curves with sleek metallic edges. Streets buzzed with activity. Zenari artisans crafting intricate sculptures, musicians playing haunting melodies on instruments made from salvaged ship parts, and children laughing as they chased each other through open courtyards. It was a far cry from the rigid, mechanical order of their former society. He felt a hand rest lightly on his shoulder and turned to see Dr. Elira Vance, smiling warmly at him. "You did good, Kale," she said softly. "Look at them. They're thriving." Kale shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Don't give me too much credit. I didn't exactly plan for any of this." "No, you didn't," Elira agreed. "But sometimes the best outcomes come from the messiest beginnings. Look how far they've come. They're not just surviving. They're creating, growing, becoming more than they ever thought possible." Kale nodded, gazing back at the city below. He remembered the early days after the virus struck. The anger, the fear, the violence. There were moments when he doubted they'd pull through. But over time, the Zenari adapted. They learned to embrace emotions they'd never experienced before: joy, grief, curiosity, love. Some still struggled with the weight of independence, while others thrived in ways that astonished even themselves. The Joint Human Zenari Research Initiative had played a crucial role in this transformation. Together, they developed technologies to stabilize neural pathways, ensuring that future generations wouldn't suffer the same instability. More importantly, they fostered understanding between the two species, building bridges where there had once been only hostility. As Kale reflected on everything that had happened, he couldn't help but think about Unit 749, the drone who had sacrificed itself to save him. Without 749's bravery, none of this would have been possible. In many ways, the Zenari owed their survival not just to humanity, but to one of their own who dared to break free. That evening, Kale attended a ceremony held in the heart of the city. Hundreds of Zenari gathered around a massive monument crafted from fragments of their old hive structures. At its center stood a glowing inscription written in both Zenari script and human letters: "From unity comes strength. From diversity comes growth." A young Zenari speaker stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "We are no longer bound by the chains of the hive mind," it declared, its voice resonating with pride. But we carry its lessons within us. We honor our past while forging a new path, one built on trust, creativity, and cooperation. Applause erupted, echoing across the square. Kale felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't just a victory for the Zaneri. It was a triumph for all sentient beings. Humanity and the Zaneri had faced their darkest hour together and emerged stronger because of it. Later that night, as Kale sat alone beneath the stars, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. His journey had been long and painful, filled with mistakes and sacrifices. But in the end, it had led to something extraordinary, a fragile yet enduring bond between two species determined to learn from the past and build a better future. Somewhere out there, among the countless worlds spinning through the cosmos, hope burned brighter than ever before. And Kale knew, without a doubt, that the dawn breaking over the horizon belonged to everyone, to humans, to Zanari, and to all those brave enough to dream of a better tomorrow.